okay. I don't know if I'll be able to keep it together. So we're in this together. Okay, guys? Today we're diving into a passage that will leave you with 3 unshakable truths. Number 1, Jesus has power over sickness and death. His love and compassion reach the desperate and the broken. And faith is trust in action. So as we walk through this text today, you'll see how these are not truths just from the past in some sort of stories, but they are realities that can transform our lives together today. So we are continuing our journey on the book of Mark. The book of Mark is a gospel, and a gospel is a type of book in the Bible that talks about Jesus, his life, his teachings, his miracle, his death, his resurrection. The word gospel means good news, and because Jesus is good news. And the gospels are a very unique literary genre. They're a blend of biographies, right? They tell us the story of Jesus, his life, his death, and resurrection. They are a historical narrative because they recorded real events and people from history. And they also are teaching literature because they include Jesus' sermons, parables, and instructions. But more than that, while they share some similarities to other ancient biographies, they are distinct because they're also called theological narratives. Because they're not just telling us about what Jesus did, but they're explaining us why it matters to our lives, for our faith, and for our salvation. In the Bible, for those who don't know, there are 4 gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each one of them give us a unique perspective on who Jesus is and what he came to do. We're in the book of Mark, and Mark focuses a lot on Jesus' actions, his miracles, his compassion, and obviously his ultimate sacrifice. The book portrays him as a servant king, showing that true greatness comes from humility and serving others. Now, let's step into the context of the chapter that we're in. Last week, we learned that Jesus calmed the storm, and he cast out a legion of demons from possessed men. So he just demonstrated in the previous, last week, he demonstrated power over nature and over the spiritual realm, essentially showing his authority as the Son of God. And so now, today, we continue to learn about his power and who he is. Now, this passage, by the way, is a little bit interesting because it involves 2 intertwined miracles. And this is a literary technique that is called a Markan sandwich, okay, where one story is placed inside another. So with all of that in mind, we're going to be having Janessa reading the passage that we're going to be focusing on today. She's actually going to wait here because, as many of you guys know, I actually am from Italy. And I want to tell you a story before we read once again the passage. So it's okay, it's 40 minutes, so don't worry about it. So I grew up in a Christian home, and my father is a pastor. I grew up in a church. I learned everything that you learn in a church. I was very knowledgeable from a very young age. However, growing up in Sicily, which I put a picture in there so everybody can be jealous, that's the city I'm from. However, growing up in Sicily, during my teenage years, I had some seriously rebellious years. I got involved with the wrong people, doing the wrong things, and getting myself in very dangerous situations. Because unfortunately in Sicily, young teens tend to grow up a little bit too fast, and they experience things that you should not be experiencing at a very young age. During that time, I fully rejected Christ. I had no interest in him, and I even went around saying, you know what, this is the biggest scam. And even my own father was involved in that scam. I was very angry, and that anger came out in so many bad situations that I got myself in. On one day, when I was 17, I was riding my motorcycle, when all of a sudden I saw a state police checkpoint. I panicked, because there was no way that I was going to get stopped with what I had in my bike. And so I did the dumbest thing that you can do in front of a police checkpoint. I made a U-turn against incoming traffic, and I started going as fast as I could, dodging cars and hoping that the cops would not see the license plate of my motorcycle. I rode for a long time, And I went into hiding thinking that I got away with it. And so as I was waiting to come down and waiting for the police to be tired of looking around, possibly for me, I noticed that my secondary phone, the phone that nobody knew I had, and that only one member of my family had, my little sister, was ringing. And she knew that I told her, you call that cell phone only if there is a huge emergency. Well, there was a huge emergency. When I picked up, she was very, very anxious. And she said, Andrea, you have to go to the police station right now because the state police has come to our house, and if you're not there by 2 p.m., they will issue an arrest warrant with your name on it. I hung up, I looked at the clock, and it was 1:40. So I emptied my bike, I got in it, and I rode as fast as I could to get to the police station to turn myself in. When I got there, I told the policeman what I did. He already knew what I was talking about. He took me in. And as I walked in, I saw my dad. He was already there. And our eyes locked for 1 second that felt like an eternity. Desperate as he looked for his son heading towards a police room. So I sat there alone. They locked the door. And I was panicking. My mind was racing so fast, 1 million miles an hour. Unsure what would happen. I was sweating, but I was cold. I was panicking inside, but I couldn't move. And I knew that this time I really messed up, and the consequences of all my actions leading up to that were right in front of me. I was desperate. It seemed like there was no solution. There was no hope. And right there, somehow, everything that my parents taught me, everything, those little sermons, youth groups, all that came to mind. And I turned to Christ. So I began to pray. But not calm prayers, kind of not very polite prayers, intense, desperate prayers. The seed of what was being taught to me, even though I was rejecting it everywhere in my life, came up. And God was the only one that I could pray to. One of my mentors told me, needs bring you to prayer, but desperate needs, they bring you to desperate prayer. And this type of desperation that I was in at that moment, where I had exhausted all my options, that type of desperation is the same one that we're going to see in the passage that Janessa is going to be reading.
Matthew 5:21-43. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hand on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Taliath cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat.
Thank you. You don't have to stay for the whole sermon. We're going to divide this story into 3 parts, okay? And in the first part, we begin our story in verse 21. Jesus just crossed back to the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee, from the region where he met the man that was possessed by many demons that Ross preached about last week. And he's returning on the other side, and a large crowd immediately comes to him. Well, this is because his reputation as a rabbi or spiritual leader or a healer and miracle worker had spread. Scholars often note that people sought him for healing, teaching, and deliverance because they instinctively recognized in him the power of God to heal and to restore. And so this crowd often included desperate, sick, outcast people, or people who were just curious to see what was going to happen. So Jesus' public ministry is growing, and the word is spreading, and people are eager for his teaching and miracles. As this is happening, we move to verse 22 and 23, where a new character or a new person is introduced, and his name is Jairus. He's a synagogue leader, and he falls at Jesus' feet, urgently begging him for his help. Now, this is so desperate that, in fact, the Greek for implored implies a desperate, continuous pleading. This wasn't just a one question. But it gets even more dramatic and serious if we actually look at who he is. See, the Bible tells us that he's a synagogue leader. This is an administrator of the synagogue, not a rabbi or a priest. His main role was to oversee the daily operations of the synagogue, including maintaining the building, organizing worship services, selecting who would read the Torah or teach, and ensuring proper order during gatherings. And this meant that he was a respected figure in the community. In fact, they were elected and appointed by the local congregation. So they were kind of pretty loved by their own people. They were men of good reputation. They were knowledgeable in Jewish law and tradition. They were capable of managing synagogue operations. And they had great influence. In fact, they were closely often aligned with the Pharisees, which were the religious leaders of the time. So this is an important man. He got friends in high places. He knows people. And there's a conflict right here in chapter 5. Because a synagogue leader normally would go to Pharisees, to the rabbis that he would know, for guidance, for prayer. And he would not go to an untrained teacher such as Jesus. See, Jesus was a controversial figure because he did not fit the typical rabbinical mold. He did not have formal training. His authority came directly from God, and often he challenged traditional interpretations of the law, often clashing with the Pharisees. But Jairus is a desperate man. His daughter is dying. And by falling at Jesus' feet, Jairus is showing everyone, he's showing public faith in Jesus' authority, risking his reputation among all of the other religious leaders, among all of the other people who had influence. See, in an honor-shame culture such as the one of Jesus' time, public status mattered, and public humiliation could ruin your personal social standing. This meant that he was willing to lose it all. He was willing to lose his status, everything that he had gained, everything, popularity, because his daughter is dying. So Jairus humbled himself before Jesus, showing his desperation in recognition of his authority. This is a dramatic moment. The crowd would have been shocked. And in verse 24, we begin to see Jesus' compassion, because he agrees with him and starts following him as the crowd continues to press on. So we move on to the second part of the story. And we read, "And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse." So in verse 25, we are introduced to the woman. A woman suffering from 12 years of bleeding, likely menstrual bleeding, and according to Levitical law, she was defined as unclean, impure. This woman, just like Jairus, was desperate. She was in a desperate condition. Why? Well, because her condition made her ceremonially and socially unclean, and that was a huge burden to live under for 12 years. See, according to Jewish law at the time, if this woman touched anyone, she would make them impure and unclean, which then would not allow you to participate in many aspects of your life, especially worship. And so by this very law, if she was married, she would have been divorced from her husband and could not live in her home. She was ostracized from all society and must not come in contact with any of her old friends. She was excommunicated from the services of the synagogue. This is someone that for 12 years was isolated, alone, hurting, insulted, avoided, looked down upon, ignored. She was a nuisance to anyone who would have seen her, anyone who would have encountered her. Not a touch, not a kind word, not a hug, not a kiss. For 12 years. Imagine that's you. This woman is desperate. Can you imagine that burden? Not only the physical, but the emotional, the mental, spiritual suffering. And on top of that, in verse 26, we see that she had suffered also under many doctors. She tried any sorts of solutions, probably some invasive and painful ones, and spent everything she had. She was poor. And instead of getting better, she got worse. She was suffering even more. She's desperate, and she had no hope. But then we read in verse 27 something special. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, then I will be healed. She's aware of Jesus. His reputation somehow got to her. She has heard who she is, and she comes up with a plan. I will touch his clothes and I'll be healed. That's not a good plan, by the way. Not a good plan at all. This woman is really risking it all. Because if that woman, who's impure, willingly is touching Jesus, who's considered a rabbi, there could have been some consequences for that action. Because it would have been seen as a defiance towards a religious leader. That's serious business. But she has faith. She has faith. She trusts that Jesus is the solution, and she's ready to take action. The recipient of her faith is Jesus. And that's all that matters. And so she goes on with her plan. And you can kind of picture her struggling through this pressing crowd, trying to be in secret, right? Because she's trying to go from behind, and she's trying to make her way. Almost you can feel the anxiety. So she's trying to not touch other people, trying to make her way through, just to go there, just for one more try, one more thing to make all the suffering stop. And we read in verse 29, immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt her body that she was freed from her suffering. It must have felt like time stopped for her. Because in verse 29, we see the first miracle. She's healed. Jesus' power is greater than sickness. Sickness is a devastating reality in our fallen world. But Jesus' power is greater than that. It's greater than disease and suffering. This woman in Mark 5 spent 12 years seeking a cure, exhausting every human option, and yet one touch of Jesus' garment accomplished what no doctor could. Jesus is more powerful than sickness. But there's another important detail here, something that is so easy to miss, but is yet so important. Remember earlier we talked about some of the some people being ritually impure, right? And that meant that they were excluded from society. And it meant that they could not touch people because if not, they would make that person unclean. So according to Jewish law, she would have made anyone that she touched unclean. And yet, when she touched Jesus, the opposite happens. This gives me chills every time. Instead of Jesus becoming unclean, his holiness overwhelmed her impurity, and she was instantaneously healed. Jesus is not just untouched by sin and impurity, he overcomes it. He destroys it. His power is so great that brokenness, sickness cannot stand against him. Wherever he goes, he just doesn't avoid impurity. He defeats it. He replaces it with healing. Jesus reverses all of that and overwhelms evil with his glory, love, and power. And that is mind-blowing. So we move on. And once Jesus realized that power had gone out of him, he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, "And yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. When the woman was healed, both the woman and Jesus knew it happened. She felt in her body that happened, and Jesus felt that power had gone out of him, which is interesting. We actually don't know what that means exactly, because this is the only miracle that we read that. So it would be interesting to ask one day, Jesus, what did that mean? But in any case, Jesus is aware of what is going on spiritually around him, and he stops right there, and he asks, "Who touched me?" And let's not forget, he's in the middle of an emergency, right? He's on his way to heal Jairus' daughter. And so in verse 31, we see the disciples, maybe they're a little annoyed. Maybe they're a little tired, right? Like all these people pushing. They're making their way to address a pretty big emergency, and Jesus stops and they ask, "Hey, what are you doing stopping, man? Do you see the crowd? Of course people are touching you. Come on, let's go heal this little girl." But Jesus keeps scanning the crowd and he's looking around. Why? Why is he asking that? He knows who did it, but it's because he's not done. There's more healing that has to happen on that day right there. So then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. So she comes forward. She stopped a healer, a rabbi, a famous one, by the way, from going to a very important person's house, a synagogue leader, to heal his dying daughter. And even the people in the crowd must have looked at her and thinking, how dare you? What are you thinking? Stopping this man, our beloved synagogue leader. Do you remember when I said that being unclean meant she would have been excluded from worship? Who do you think is the one that enforced that? The synagogue leader. This makes this encounter pretty intense, because Jairus, who is the one that was upholding the law, is now waiting there with Jesus right in front of this woman, the same woman that likely he would have excluded from worship. That's a powerful moment. She risked it all. She knew it was her. Her conscience wouldn't let her, be quiet. So she goes to Jesus' feet and tells him everything. She confesses everything, the whole truth. Jesus is interested in the whole truth, not because he needs it, but because it's good for us. And it might seem that the only purpose was to embarrass her, embarrass this poor woman, but that wasn't the purpose at all. Here, Jesus is about to blow everybody's mind. This is where his incredible compassion comes out. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Jesus affirms her. "Daughter, your faith has made you well, has healed you." See, most people at the time would have thought she deserved it. Whatever she was going through was her fault anyway, was the punishment of God. So kind of like she deserved it, so who cares, right? And how many times do we think like that, right? Just like the Pharisees were kind of happy that some people are going through some tough times because they deserve it. How many times do we agree with the Pharisees? We look at another human being and we're like, it's your problem, not mine. Instead of feeling Jesus' compassion. And he acknowledges her. He says, "Daughter." Did you know Jesus never called anyone else daughter in all the Gospels? Jesus wanted her to come forth and hear a special name of tenderness. Jesus did it because he wanted to bless her in a special way. Daughter. She didn't hear a kind word, for 12 years. And here's a rabbi, Jesus, God, calling her daughter. Can you imagine the good that did to her? And today, Jesus is calling you, son, daughter, come to me. But there's more. Because, of course, Jesus does the incredible. Jesus is restoring her identity and her dignity. This woman who has been suffering for 12 years was isolated from the community, unable to worship, and probably even abandoned by her family. By calling her daughter, Jesus is publicly restoring her identity. Not just the healing of the body, but reaffirming her worth that she was a beloved child of God. In Jewish culture, addressing someone as daughter was deeply personal. It wasn't just a term of kindness, but a statement of belonging. Jesus, as the Son of God, essentially is telling her, you're mine. You're mine. You belong to me and to my Father. And where no one else wants you, I do. I want you to be mine. And that's the connection. That's the link between the two stories, right? Jesus is healing a woman who's been suffering for 12 years and calls her daughter, while he's on his way to heal Jairus' daughter who's 12. Jesus' compassion is incredible, but he just didn't do it just for her. He also did it for others, so that they would know that she was healed. This woman had a problem that nobody really could see. So it would have been a little suspicious if all of a sudden she was like, oh, I'm healed. It's gone. Most people would have thought she's lying. Right? So Jesus calls her out in front of everyone, so there is no doubt that she's healed. He's restoring her in front of everyone. And he says, your faith has healed you. Jesus didn't want her to think that she stole a blessing. He didn't want her to never be able to look at him in the eyes. She didn't steal anything. She received it by faith, and Jesus wanted her and everyone else to know that. But also, Jesus wanted her to know why she was healed. He says, your faith has made you well. It wasn't really the touching of the clothes that healed her. Instead, it was her faith in Jesus and the love that he has for her. Instead of rebuking her, Jesus affirming her and calls her daughter. There's no condemnation, there's only compassion here. What a lesson for us to learn. And there's one more thing. The Greek word for made well also means saved. And that shows that the healing is not just physical, not just public restoration, but also spiritual, making her whole in every possible way. This is so incredible. But let's not forget that in this beautiful moment right there, someone else is standing right next to Jesus. Jairus. He's still waiting. He's waiting for Jesus to go and heal his dying daughter. The clock is ticking. It must have felt like an eternity. And so we continue to a third part of the sermon. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? Overhearing what they said, Jesus told them, don't be afraid, just believe. So messengers arrive and deliver the 4 worst words that any parent can hear. Your child is dead. That's devastating news. It's too late now. And I can't not even begin to imagine Jairus' emotions. He's done everything right. He's a good guy, keeping all the rules. And here this happens to him. His heart must have been sinking. And to the messengers, Jesus' role is done. It's like, sorry, we don't get what we want, so we don't need to bother you anymore. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And so Jesus says, don't be afraid, just believe, which are hard words to hear in an emergency like that. His daughter is dead, and Jesus tells him to just believe. Jesus here is offering hope. He's offering an alternative to desperation. So we continue. He did not let anyone follow him except for Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, which is commonly referred as the inner circle, by the way, the closest disciples of Jesus. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father, mother, and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. So Jesus enters Jairus' house, and it's chaos. It must have been chaos, right? Grief, crying, but he comes in with peace and authority. And we see that there are mourners wailing. I don't know if you knew this, but it was customary in the day to hire people, professional criers, professional mourners. And so they would be there and just kind of cry and make more of an atmosphere. But that's all superficial, because they switched from crying to laughing pretty quickly. And so Jesus asks, why all the crying? It tells him that she's just sleeping. And this is not Jesus playing make-believe or making light of the death of a child, but instead Jesus is foreshadowing his authority and victory over death. And they ridiculed him. But Jesus was unfazed. And I love this. He just kicks them all out. It's like he doesn't want nothing to do with those people who do not believe in his promises. He drove them out so they wouldn't even discourage the faith of Jairus and the mother. And so we go on, and he goes inside the room. He took her by hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old, they were completely astonished. Again, quick important detail here, entering a room with a dead person and touching their body would have made you unclean as well. Same with the woman. But again, Jesus is more powerful than that, right? And so Jesus raises the girl up with a simple command, which means, little girl, arise. And we see the second miracle. His power over death is revealed. Instead of Jesus becoming unclean, his holiness overwhelmed her death. He did not receive death, he gave life. Jesus' daughter had already died, and Jesus spoke, and death itself obeyed him. His authority is absolute, and his power is unlimited. Can you imagine the parents? You're there. What a roller coaster of emotion, even for Jairus, everything he witnessed that day. Can you imagine your little girl, your little son smiling at you again after going through that? They are completely in awe. And then we read he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. Jesus told them to not tell anyone, which sometimes is a little bit confusing. By the way, that happens a lot throughout the Bible, throughout the Gospels. And this is called normally like a messianic secret. Okay, some theologians give some ideas on why. Why is he telling them not to tell anyone? Often they say because they don't want the misunderstanding of Jesus' mission, kind of mistaking him for a military leader. He's trying to avoid premature opposition. In other words, the timing isn't right yet. So he's saying, hold on, don't say anything yet because it's not the right time. And also to keep the focus on God's glory, on the faith that the people have demonstrated rather than the show. And this is my favorite part. He tells people to give her food. I love that. But there's a little bit of meaning behind that. Because just like with the woman earlier, this is Jesus restoring the little girl. See, eating is a sign of wellness, of full restoration. She's not a ghost. She's alive and well, and she's eating. And Jesus normalizes her. Instead of her being something like to study or be weirded out and not knowing who she is, he's restoring like, hey, that's the girl you've always known. Give her a sandwich. These two stories are so powerful and meaningful. And it's important that we look at the theological points that are made here. See, the essential theological message of Mark 5:21-43 is that the power of Jesus over sickness and death, his deep compassion for those who suffer as he tenderly responds to their needs with healing and restoration, and the necessity of faith in experiencing his saving work. And very quickly, let me just say that miracles in the Bible are there to demonstrate God's power, to confirm his messengers, to reveal his kingdom. They serve as signs to point to God's authority over everything. They bring him glory, showing his sovereignty. And they often illustrate deeper spiritual truth. And so ultimately, miracles are not just displays of power, but they're invitations to trust in Jesus and the gospel. So a few applications. What are ways that we can apply all of this? I'm sure there's a lot, but here's just 5. Jesus is Lord over every situation. We can rest confident that Jesus is greater than anything. When we face trials, Jesus is stronger. He is more powerful than any circumstances. No matter how hopeless a situation seems, Jesus is Lord over it. Faith is trust in action. Faith is not passive, it moves. It moves us towards Christ when everything else tries to hold us back. True faith is more than just simple belief. True faith puts our trust in Jesus and it pushes us past fear, uncertainty, and obstacles, reaching for Jesus even in the midst of desperation. Jesus overcomes evil with good. Nothing is too dark, nobody's too dark, too broken, or too lost for him to redeem. Because of his power and goodness, we can bring him anything. Our fears, our failures, our deepest needs, knowing that he is able to restore and make things new. We can receive Jesus' compassion in our lives. He offers compassion, not condemnation. Bring your burdens to him. Trust in his timing. Listen to his words of comfort. Receive his personal love. God sees you and I as people, not nameless individuals, but as his children. And lastly, we are called to show Jesus' compassion to others. Just as Jesus saw, stopped, and cared for those in need, we are called to demonstrate his compassion in our everyday interactions. So being present with others, not overlooking the unnoticed, speaking words of hope and forgiveness, caring for practical needs, helping restoring people. And so as we conclude the sermon, we're soon going to be moved to the baptisms. And today we looked at the power of Jesus, the compassion of Jesus, and the faith is trust in action. And we saw how people in desperation, they come to Jesus, which as you remember is exactly where we left 17-year-old Andrea at the beginning of that sermon. See, on that day at the police station, I waited 8 hours. 8 hours before I saw anyone coming in through the door. I prayed for 8 hours straight while my dad was in the waiting area, most likely in full desperation for his son. And after that 8 hours, the police officer comes in and he's silent and he sat right in front of me with a file in his hand and he's just looking through it. And when he broke the silence, which felt for like an eternity, he looked at me in the eyes for what he felt again for a long time. And then he asked me one simple question: what are you doing with your life? After a few moments, he continued and he said, why are you throwing away your life? Running away from a checkpoint is a felony. In Italy, you can be thrown into juvenile just in time for you to turn 18 and get processed as an adult. My mind quickly pictured that scenario of my life completely ruined. I played with fire and I finally got burned. And then a miracle happened. He looked at me in the eyes and said, you're too young to throw away your life. I'm going to give you another chance. And I couldn't believe it. I'm standing there. And he continued to say, I will make this a normal infraction. You will pay the fine, and nothing will go in your permanent record. You're free to go. Go to your father, and you both go home. And he said, if I catch you again, you're done. And with that, he just stood up, left the room, and left the door unlocked. When I got out, my dad was right there. I just hugged him. God hugged him. We didn't say a single word from that moment till we got home. That policeman changed the course of my life. He could have absolutely swung the hammer and end me right then and there. But I offered compassion and mercy. And that was the beginning of a series of moments that will lead me right back to Christ. Sometimes compassionate and merciful acts lead to consequences that are beyond our comprehension. This is not a way to justify evil or bad actions, but it's a reminder that Christ died on the cross and he was risen from the dead to bring life, to bring eternal life, and to give people second chances. In Mark 5, we saw how Jesus brings healing to the untouchable, hope to the hopeless, and life where there's only death. He brought compassion and restoration. So for the suffering, Jesus sees you. Reach out to him. For the hopeless, Jesus is with you. Trust him. For the fearful, do not be afraid. Only believe. For the weary, Jesus has the power to restore. Bring your burdens to him. For the silent believer, step forward in faith. Declare what Christ has done. For the doubting, even small faith in a great Savior changes everything. And for all of us, Jesus is Lord over everything. Put your trust in him. Today, we're going to see trust in action. Today, we're going to see faith through the baptisms. Baptisms are a declaration of that same faith that we saw in those stories. We're going to witness 4 people declaring their love and their salvation for Jesus Christ. So we're going to celebrate together in just a few moments. As the worship team comes up, I'm going to be praying, and then we'll move to baptisms. Father, we are in awe of your love, of your compassion. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you have done for us. I pray that we can all put our faith in you. I pray that we can trust you, and then we can act on that. Thank you again for this morning and for the beautiful, beautiful moments we're about to witness. In your name we pray. Amen.